So here is our wonderful panel and me. And first of all, I'd like to ask Eileen and Paul to start us off on the topic of trust.
Thanks very much, Ray. So nobody gave Ray a warm introduction, but as you can see, the guy gets around. There's nobody on the panel that he hasn't worked with. So it's so great to reconnect with you. When we started discussing this panel, Paul and I both had a very similar concept as to what we wanted to talk about, and that was the role that technology has played in trust in our industry. And in some ways, it feels a bit prescient to the times we're in, as we spend a great deal of our time over the last few weeks trying to weigh what technology sources we want to rely on and who to trust and who's earned our trust. So I wanted to just kick us off by talking a little bit about what we believe has happened to trust in our industry. You know, you could successfully argue that as an industry, we've sort of poisoned our own pond. And the public doesn't trust the insights industry in the way that they might have in the past. We recruit people to surveys, panels and communities, and we sort of promise them rich rewards and wonderful experiences, only to inflict some really pretty painful experiences upon them. And I would encourage those who are on the client side of the business on this webinar that it would be great if everyone could commit that they would never launch a survey that they haven't taken themselves, to get a sense of what it is we're asking participants to do for us. So while some of these things have certainly been margin building and good for the bottom line in our industry, I'd argue that in many ways they've been sort of soul destroying for participants. In addition to that, some in our industry have use technology to gather data that participants never really intended to share with us. We had all kinds of ways to get secondary data. Cambridge Analytica goes without saying as an example of that. And while we've been doing those sorts of things, we've been lamenting the decline in participation and the quality of that participation. So we do find ourselves in the proverbial mess of our own making. So Paul and I wanted to talk about two different approaches to how we might rebuild trust, and the same kind of technology as a platform that perhaps destroyed some of that trust, we think could be the cure to our problems. So I'm going to kick it over to Paul, who's going to talk a little bit about some experiences from analogous industries that he's been in, and how technology has changed and affected those industries. And then I'll pick it back up to talk a little bit about the role of technology in rehabilitating and reforming the experience for research participants. So with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Paul.
Thanks, Eileen. By nature of, what we do, we think of trust on, a daily basis. And I've heard a number of times that the industry that we are in is actually, focused around trust. So, part of my perspective is that, the industry has been really focused and fascinated with these concepts of automation and programmatic over the last number of years, for a number of years now. And this is a natural development. The result really has been price compression and agility, but at the same time, this has been a race to the bottom at the cost of the consumer experience, compensation, and ultimately trust. And I'll often describe, think of this as a collective action problem where, collectively we know some of the problems and some of the, systemic, issues, but we're not collectively, addressing it. So in many times we see that what technology does is it affords you the ability to be arm's length from the responsibility and accountability of what's happening downstream. If you look at what's happening in some, for example, some of the open exchanges, survey failure rates are anywhere from 70 to 90%. So for every time that there is a poor survey experience, that a participant has, trust is further eroded. And I believe that, one of the core ways that we start approaching this is to think about accountability through transparency. In many aspects of our lives, transparency And communicating transparency is one of the ways that we build trust with, individuals. And, no surprise, I've been, bullish and pretty vocal that there's some very interesting techniques that we can learn from technologies such as, blockchain. And, I'm really fascinated with this approach where we need to shift the custody of data and the control back to the consumer, because this ultimately puts us at a disadvantage in having to operate on terms that works with, the participants, and, starting to think about privacy more from privacy by design versus, compliance. And this means focusing on things like, validation and, operating within consent. And so adopting brutal transparency and accountability is one of the ways that we approach these, and applying some of these, game theory basics, rewarding positive experiences and ways to discourage, I don't want to say punish, but discouraging some of these poor survey experiences. And, change requires some level of discomfort. And, for some time now, we've been able to disguise from, discomfort. And one of the analogies I like to look at is, let's think what's happened to digital advertising and ad tech in the last 5 years. I describe ad tech as often being about 5 years ahead in some developments, but they were in a similar place where automation and programmatic came along, and this became a breeding ground for fraud. But as well, this also brought transparency, and we had these moments where individuals like Mark Pritchard of P&G stood up publicly and refused to pay for any kind of impressions that did not have validated quality to it. And overnight, this nearly collapsed half of the industry. And we started seeing companies, billion-dollar companies like Rocket Fuel, in a short amount of time, being sold off for pennies. And I do believe that this is coming to the industry, sooner than later, unless we can fix and address some of these, fundamental, foundational, challenges in the industry around trust and consumer engagement. So with that, I'd like to throw it out to the group for, thoughts. And
is this trust is kind of quite a big suitcase word. It's got a lot of stuff in it, and I guess you've touched on the experience that people have participating and giving their data. There's a trust in the supply chain being grubby and actually using poor quality or fabricated data to make decisions. And there's kind of like a trust thing in the wider world about, are we actually, particularly around polling especially, but, some of the other issues you mentioned, like data security and stuff. What's the sort of biggest challenge there, do you think? Paul, you're obviously focusing quite heavily on the kind of quality through the supply chain, but do you think that's the biggest trust issue that we're facing?
Yeah, I generally feel that, if we go to the core of it, is building trust with the participant, because everything downstream is affected. As soon as you break that trust, you then have, the supply chain issues are complicated. The, quality issue is a ramification. And, one of the discussions we often have is, what is trust? How do you define? Is there an equation for trust? And I often think of it as, trust is consistency over time while motivations hold, constant. And this kind of begs to, if there's a repeatable experience that has, positive experiences and outcomes for consumers, we are now starting conditioning ourselves and respondents to behave in positive ways. Like, I don't think there's any participants that are necessarily out trying to, always kind of game us. They're just trying to make it through a survey, and we don't make it easy for them. So I'm very bullish that we focus on.
So okay, Priscilla, just before you jump in, Eileen, do you want to add the second perspective, and then we'll bring Priscilla in to respond to both of those?
Sure will, Ray. As our industry's evolved, we have become more and more focused on behalf of our clients on the customer experience. And I would argue we're a little like, shoemakers whose children go barefoot. in that we don't spend much time and attention on the experience we're actually delivering to the respondent or the participant. And to Mike's point, that whole sort of quality of what goes into the funnel certainly contributes to what comes back out, the other end, and, the proverbial garbage in, garbage out. And just to give you a little analogy, I did a little study not too long ago where I said, okay, let's buy the most cost-effective sample we possibly can, because I feel like that's the pressure in the industry to get as cost-effective as we possibly can. And because the technology I was using involved face-to-face using video and cameras, you could actually get a sense of what you were really getting. And our rationale was, if at the lowest possible point we get quality that is not wildly different than at a premium price, well, of course, that would be a big win for everyone. Unfortunately, that's not what we found. We found that some of the technologies that we're using really are not generating quality that, when I was on the buyer side, I would have found remotely acceptable. But I do think on the buyer side, there's a temptation to do the proverbial don't ask, don't tell. I want a cost-effective project, and I want compelling data with great storytelling. But what actually goes into that recipe, the actual ingredients, are not of the quality that we expect. And I think some of it goes back to this very earliest point about the experience that we give research participants. One of the things that we're trying to do, and I think many in the industry are trying to do, is use technology to return some semblance of a human touch to the process. If you look at many of our online questionnaires, they look very similar to a standardized test you would have taken, at age 14, where you're checking boxes and filling in circles. And I'm a very firm believer that none of us really want to be tested or studied. We want to be heard. And the basic motivation behind why people do participate in research still remains the desire to be heard and the desire to influence the products and services that are available. So, if you think back to the days when you were actually talking to an interviewer, you were getting some feedback, you were getting some reinforcement, you were feeling heard. Some technologies today are available, and I think Ray's going to touch on AI, which I think is very promising on this front, to try and get some of the humanity back in the process. And I do think that same kind of rebuilding the human touch in our industry will help reestablish trust with participants, rather than taking this really arduous test for which a few points show up in my portal somewhere. And it's all very transactional. So I'm a big advocate that regaining some humanity and giving participants some emotional reward, along with the relatively modest financial remuneration that we give them. Again, tech can play a big role. We're using chatbots a lot. We don't pretend that they're real people, but we do try and make them feel authentic and warm, and providing feedback to your answers. And that's just one example. I think some of the work that's being done with the use of video, and there are a number of agencies out there using it, is also a super humanizing. It's the same way we communicate with each other in our everyday lives. So with that, I'll pause, and Ray, kick it back to you for any questions.
Well, I'm going to hand it back to Priscilla, who I cut up slightly earlier.
Actually, that was Eileen, but I will chime in. First of all, I love where Eileen started us by saying, could we all please commit to not putting a survey out in the field that we haven't actually taken? It sounds so simple, but I really love it. While I'm a marketing professional serving the insights industry, I do have a degree in cultural anthropology. So I absolutely come from an understanding of seeing something from someone else's point of view. And when we think about that kind of an emic view, I think what's at the root of it is curiosity. And I think sometimes that's what goes by the wayside when we start implementing technology and starting using multiple platforms or really trying to get something in the field quickly, efficiently. These are all good things, but you're right, the humanity goes by the wayside. And I love what Paul said when he said that trust is consistency over time while motivation remains constant. And I think that's true. I really think that we need to hone in on the trust, but I think that the trust, we're motivated to build that trust because we are really grounding ourselves in our natural curiosity about people. And what I mean by curiosity about people is that our participants, like Eileen mentioned, our participants are participating for a reason. Can we really understand that? Could we maybe even do some persona work to understand why people even want to take their time to do these things? There is a reason they're participating. There is some form of desire to influence. We don't know to what degree if we haven't done that work. But, they're on the platform. And I guess my last question about my last, point about the technology is somehow they got on that platform through all those motivations of their own that have nothing to do with us and our big plans and our, data that we need to move our companies forward. They got there somewhere. What was that journey? And do we care about what that journey was? Because I think when we get curious and we care about that journey, then we'll begin to understand the quality of who we have responding. And I believe then that is kind of the basis of why we would actually engage in behaviors that are building trust.
So I'm going to pick up on a couple of the questions that are in the chat stream, particularly one for Paul. There's another one for Eileen in a moment, which is to do with the fact that people feel inundated at the moment. Somebody here talking about receiving 10 survey requests. If we transfer more control and power to people, and I don't think that anybody on this panel would disagree with that, presumably they're going to use that to stop themselves being pestered by these annoying, repetitious, boring, unpleasant, non-emotional requests to do different sorts of tasks.
Okay, I have so much to say about that.
Well, I was going to let Paul come in first.
Sure.
Yes, and I think that's the discomfort that we need, is that, if there isn't any way of providing some control to push that stuff out of the ecosystem, to make that stuff difficult to, get through, we'll always have this notion of continually doing that. There is really no downside today to kind of, put out questionable, content at the lowest price, because you'll always find somebody who's willing to expose their audiences to it. So I think that is the discomfort that this industry needs, is to, change the motivations of what we're willing to put out there.
Mm-hmm.
So Priscilla, briefly, and then Mike.
Yeah, I would love to say sometime we talk about all this trust with, to respondents, and that's absolutely the core about what we're talking about. But also, I like to trust the technology, because there's one beautiful thing that people don't realize about social media sometimes, and that is that it works very well to help people scroll right past non-relevant messages and to stop getting things there that they don't want, and to actually begin to choose via AI and algorithms the things that to them have undeniable value. And so in some ways, the systems themselves can, help, depending on what system we use. There are some systems that can help us weed out some of these other people who are not following this type of meaningful work, and they're not attracting the right people. The problem is that once you get to a platform or you buy sample product programmatically, the question is, how did they get into this pool? And that's where I think there's a deeper dive at social media and how participants are recruited and what's that conversation that they're having, what they expect, what kind of things are motivating them. So obviously that goes a little bit of a different direction, but I think it's one part of the ecosystem.
And I just want to pick up on something that Priscilla mentioned there. I do think the days where we used to have meaningful discussions with clients about where the sample's coming from need to come back. Some of this is on the agency side of the industry where we think, clients aren't interested in that. They can't be bothered with it. And I think often, as a research buyer, I would have teams that would come to me and I'd say, well, where did this sample come from? And they really didn't know. Their agency partner made that selection, quite independently and autonomously. And I think it's really a shared responsibility that we on the agency side and everybody on the buyer side are having meaningful discussions about what is going into a sample.
Absolutely. Now, we've somewhat overrun our time on the first of our 4 topics. So, Paul, is there anything you'd like to add briefly before we tackle the next one? And I'm going to work out what to do with the questions. Perhaps we can post them as freestanding comments afterwards for people to access.
Yeah, my only additional comment is it's very apparent that this is this issue of trust is on the forefront of a lot of individuals in the industry, and it's kind of fundamental to to what you do. So, just really excited that these these discussions continue and having these opportunities to talk about these things. So
great. And from what I'm reading here, it's a very wide topic, but it's a very deep and troubled topic. So thank you, Eileen and Paul, for bringing that up. Mike, you're going to challenge whether a lot of us are going to be kind of redundant or obsolete.
Yeah, this feels potentially like an insensitive topic given where we are at the moment and what's going on, but it's not intended to be provocative, and full sympathies with people who are going through business dropping off a cliff at the moment and wondering where their next jobs are going to come from. But the question was more about the longer term changes in how insight work and research gets done in organizations. And if you look at the adjacent areas to market research, I know a lot of us don't like to call it that, consumer insights, but if you look at user research or at analytics or at the customer experience world, what you're finding is a lot of capability is being embedded into software or into other teams' workflows. So it's no longer the case that somebody would brief a research team to run a customer satisfaction program, or that they'd come and ask them to do, in a lot of cases, do some social listening work that might sit within a marketing or a brand team. So there's a lot of areas in organizations that are doing their own research, and this is beyond the kind of the market research industry often doesn't help itself by saying that people who use SurveyMonkey are just doing quick and dirty work. That is not the case in user research teams. In fact, the user research platforms are integrating backwards into design workflows, product management workflows. So if you're a designer and you've got a prototype for a new website, a new app that's clickable in InDesign or Sketch, you can actually just, through a simple API, go and connect to half a dozen users and get them to give you some live feedback, screen share, video feedback, all of that captured. You do that as a designer. You don't need even to talk to a user researcher. If you're in marketing teams, often they're now getting hands-on, simple feedback tools, but, things like Typeform or a test is a platform that is used increasingly by marketing teams to do brand tracking or to do quick deep dive stuff. And a lot of newer businesses, if you start in the digital space, if you're a high growth startup, you start with a commercial technical founder, you might add some analytics as you get product feedback. You then might add a user research capability. You're quite a long way down the line before you've added customer insight or market research, So I guess the question for me is, all of this stuff is happening. People are self-sufficient around the organization, whether it's in analytics or user research, where these are becoming capabilities, not teams. So it's not like there's an ivory tower of expertise that everyone has to go and knock on the door. This is stuff that people can do. What's the role of researchers? What is the future for specialist research teams, specialist agencies who traditionally have done stuff, but potentially are going to be doing less stuff going forward, and they're going to be enabling others, teaching others, providing best practice. I guess, that's the question. What do we think as a group the role of tomorrow's insight professional research agency and team is going to be?
So Eileen, you used to run one of the world's largest agencies, and now you run a group that's got a technology company and research capabilities. So how would you respond to Mike on that?
I think what Mike's talking about is spot on, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for the industry. When I was running an agency, one of the most difficult things to do was to keep our staff engaged in highly repetitive processes. Once you've done your 7,000th link test, the bloom is sort of off the rose. And so some of the technology that is in place to allow those repeatable processes to be done much more efficiently, I think is great for our business. It allows us to have people working on more interesting, more challenging kinds of projects and programs. But I do think there's going to be a role for sort of an insights coach on the corporate side within companies. There are so many amazing tools right now, but I'm sure all of you have received at any given point in time a survey where you go, this was certainly designed by somebody who didn't have a clue. And I agree with Mike, not everything being done on SurveyMonkey is quick and dirty, but you do see an awful lot of work where you think, oh, Madonna, who wrote this questionnaire? And so I do think there's going to be a role just making sure that within companies, bad research isn't getting disseminated because people simply didn't have anybody to turn to for advice. Now, I think some of the things that are being done where good decision rules are built into the tech, which Mike spends a lot of time looking at, is also super helpful. So I don't think it's an or situation. I think there will probably be fewer jobs doing repetitive tasks. There will be things that agencies once did that they don't do anymore. But I do think that opens up, Ray, you touched on earlier, the whole idea of storytelling and really making insights useful and getting them to sing. I still think that's going to be something that is going to be high human touch.
Yeah, I like to think of this as breaking it out into two parts, and I couldn't agree more. And I've heard of a couple instances, won't name names, but tools like SurveyMonkey and stuff are being banned in some organizations just because it creates a bit of a Wild West and questions about using some of these questionable data collection and survey structure to make decisions and such. But I like to break it out in what we're seeing is a shift in the organizational function. We used to have these nice clean departments, but now we start seeing these individuals in like a business intelligence area, and then we also then start seeing the skill set starting to fundamentally change. There's a lot of job ads now that are asking for people with experience in Python and R, and that stuff is changing. And recently I've listened to this really interesting podcast that was talking about job skills. And some of the analysis, one of the things that really bubbled to the top that's not being met are people with data interpretation skills. We're generating so much data today. The lack is being able to understand data, to question data, to look at sources, and to garner insights from that. And I think that's a skill set that this industry has a real powerful contribution. So we have this shifting of skills, but at the same time repositioning. Where does it appear in the organization? I think fundamentally, these clean research departments just won't exist at the way they do today. But that's also a great opportunity, I think, across the board.
I wonder as well, if picking up on what Paul has just been saying, if we look at the structural changes, the move towards tribes and chapters. So tribes would be everybody dealing with the online business, Another tribe would be people doing the face-to-face business. Another one would be the new products business within the company. And then we have chapters, which are specialist skills, and they sit within the tribe. So it's a cross-matrix system. So your market research specialist would actually be embedded. And I think, Mike, you ran a very interesting session in Amsterdam where you looked at the UXs, where the UX researchers are specialists. They're typically much more like people in a chapter in that they are embedded into other teams. So maybe it's how do we connect people into a chapter through it as an industry, even though they are embedded in different places throughout the structure.
Yeah, I think insight teams have swung over the years between, when they restructure and restructure again, from having capability embedded closer to stakeholders, with the marketing teams or the brand teams, or pulling it back centrally. And then there's fights over reporting lines and all this kind of stuff. And I agree with you about, that often the user researchers are more closely aligned to the teams that are doing stuff. But I think this feels like a potentially more fundamental change in structures and how the insight capability gets embedded across the organization.
And we've got a couple of points coming in here from outside, one of which is, are all these really clunky NPS surveys a result of what you're talking about, Mike? And are we going to get, when we use the technology, and this perhaps comes back a little bit more to Paul's zone, getting a conflict between being empathetic with customers and being more technology driven?
On the first point, I think that actually goes right back to what Paul said about, or connects back to the programmatic ad thing. The number of feedback requests you get, you've bought something, you nearly bought something, you walked into a store, you've been to a bathroom, press this button, it's just overwhelming, So I think that to me is a little bit like being besieged by terrible, banner ads on websites that are full of them. So that's not going to help the industry in terms of, over researching and overplaying those type of things. So that's just abuse of the technology.
Super. Okay, so let's keep the pace moving. And Priscilla, what have you brought along to show today?
Well, technology is an interesting part of this. This is the main discussion, but social media is an interesting thing that people don't often think of as a technology anymore. It's so ingrained in what we do and how we live. In fact, I think social media has fundamentally changed the way we do business. And I have a lot of marketing professionals, market research professionals who talk with me and say, well, I'm on LinkedIn or I'm on Twitter. And to me, that doesn't really mean anything. I feel like that powerful technology is really being woefully underused. And in light of the conversation that we've had about curiosity and trust, I think this technology of social media can absolutely be driving the way we engage with each other on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and it can be creating conversations that help us set up the kind of study and the kind of work that we all want to do and that we would all be proud of. But specifically, my issue in the market research field is that there's a lot of communication going on. There's a lot of presentations going on. There's a lot of surveys going in the field. But I don't think that there's a lot of that humanity in the thought process behind the messaging before it goes out. And whether you're talking to a participant, you're a salesperson trying to sell sample, you're sitting in a meeting and actually discussing, what should we be looking at, no matter what piece. My life's work really has been around a deep love of personas, and that understanding your audience really creates a better vision for who your marketing message is for, who your survey is for, who you should be talking to in the meeting, just across the board. It affects everything. And I think people just think about personas as it relates to, straight marketing. And I just think there's a lot of other places that it could work. So I mentioned before that technology allows us to scroll past the non-relevant and stop really at the undeniably value. undeniably valuable. But I do think when we do proper persona work as companies, we start clarifying who we actually help the best, who we help the most, and who we help meaningfully. And I think if we start there, then we won't end up in these desperately difficult, convoluted, and hard to extricate ourselves from surveys and protocols and and kind of these NPS surveys that we're scratching our head and not even sure where they're going.
Sorry, I just realised I was unmuted there. So if we were trying to convey some of these trust issues, how might we set around looking at the personas and the right sort of communications? Because most of the things I have seen around trust have been, I don't know which persona they were targeted at. They weren't targeted at anybody I've ever met.
Well, I'm speaking more from the part where, a market research firm sells this to an end client. So a lot of times my work is so much before it actually gets into the field. But that's my point, is that the trust has to start there. And a lot of people are doing marketing to get marketing done. And so this is kind of the old adage of, get the kind of fish based on the kind of bait you use. And so they kind of do this, we'll do anything for anybody type of thing. And the moment you as a firm stop saying you'll do anything for anybody, you've started on a strategic journey. And then we can start talking about how we can get marketing done, not for the sake of getting marketing done, but getting marketing done to attract the most ideal clients who are willing to sit down at the table and say, you know what, we're going to take the extra time and we are going to find out where the respondents come from. We're going to, build in a little bit of time to discuss how we can make sure that we're being respectful to the participants on the survey. We want to know why they're doing it, and so I think that's kind of that same old adage that is, it all starts at the top. If from the very beginning of selling the actual project, we're understanding our audience, we're fishing with the kind of bait that we really purposefully want, then we're going to be able to set ourselves up to have these kinds of better conversations. And then we can attract the most ideal client, the most ideal partner, to genuinely help them solve their most persistent and even some new emerging problems.
So, Mike, Eileen.
No, I was going to say, one of the things that I think technology has definitely done is, Priscilla mentioned this idea of when an agency presents themselves as all things to all people. I do think as companies have had to focus their attention and their budgets on technology, it's also forced them to be very good at a smaller number of things. And when I'm on the buying side, I certainly look at what technology a company is investing in, because to me, that is a very clear signal of what they really are specialized in and what they really are good at.
Yeah, I see this as a shift towards quality, because we're talking about thinking, a lot more closely about messages, meaningful communication, meaningful experiences. And, one of the, downsides that we've seen with social media is the approach a lot of people will take is, because of the volume, it's just spray and pray. And you can experiment in the field. And I think for a long time, it's really, led people to kind of ignore some of those important strategy sessions and discussions up front, so that when you make, some kind of communication and connection, it's much more, meaningful. And, the tendency is, people will blame it on the individual, that nobody's paying attention anymore. And I've always kind of challenged that. I don't think it's the case that on social media, people aren't paying attention. I think they're just more efficient at filtering and ignoring what's not interesting. So there's real opportunity to deliver those meaningful messages on these channels.
Absolutely. And I think delivering those meaningful messages requires stepping back and doing really high quality persona work, so we know how to phrase it in a way where someone looks at the message and says, that's for me, and they engage. But if we, go into it and we don't do that work, we not only get horrible participants, but we lose the control of the quality, and then we lose the control of the trust. There really is no care for the participant going on at that point, and that will just extend all the way out through the data. And to think that it doesn't is just absolutely naive.
Okay, so moving on again, we now get to mine, and there is a surprise additional one at the end, which I've not warned the panel about because it's come from one of the listeners. So my topic is, how can we leverage artificial intelligence to enhance our humanity? And I think that some of the work that the chatbot companies are doing, like Rival, that Eileen is responsible for, like lots of other companies, that's making it more human. And the more they're beginning to put in the ability to tailor the question to people, that's good. But I'm thinking about, what does it do to our job as insights professionals? It can do, if we do it right, it will do the grunt work so that we have the time and the ability to add in that emotional piece. And to give you one example, I sometimes do text analytics. I'll use unsupervised machine learning to do topic modeling. And the first solution it comes up with is rubbish. And I look at it and I say, well, why is it rubbish? Oh, it's because it's made this assumption that in this category, risk is a bad thing. But actually, risk in financial planning is a good thing. So I need to change the way the software is running. And then I look at the next one. I say, oh, that's too granular. No, the next one is too combined. And then we get the porridge that's just right. But to do that, we've got to be in the right place using the right tools. So I was working with a company just the other week, and I was looking at how they were doing their analytics, and they were sending it over to the marketing scientists. The next day back, they got some results, and they would say, well, those aren't quite right. So they would send it back to the marketing scientists. No, the person doing the story finding and who is going to be involved in the storytelling has to either be sat next to the person running the AI, or they've got to learn how to run the AI. And that's one of the really interesting features. There was a great presentation in Barcelona at the SMR Fusion conference, talking about how people were using R-Shiny to put usable front ends onto clever R procedures so that you could get them in the hands of the sort of people that Mike was talking about, distributed throughout the organization, because that is where the sense is going to be made out of using AI. We've really got to get it to replace the grunt so that we can, those of our colleagues who are good at finding stories can do that. I don't know if anybody would agree or disagree.
I do absolutely agree. I think there's a lot of there's quite a lot of fear in the industry when you talk about AI and people go, robots taking our jobs, and actually it's it's a good thing when a lot of the grunt work is taken away, as you say. But I mean, interestingly, when you look historically, most big technological innovations have actually increased the share of wealth going to labour and the number of jobs that AI is actually creating in all sorts of hidden ways. So, people who are having to work more with these models, to build these models, and obviously the armies of coders in all over the world who are tagging and training models all over the place. So there's a lot more human effort around AI than I think is appreciated, and it's not actually reducing, it's shifting the type of work that's being done. So from a human angle, it's not taking jobs away, it's changing them. I think it definitely has the potential to reduce a lot of grunt work, or to shorten the cycles on projects in, like you say, things like text analytics, image analytics, that sort of thing. But I think the third thing actually comes back to what we started with, which is the progress in some of these language models is just astonishing. Microsoft released something a couple of weeks ago, their latest model. It's got something like 17 billion features to it. I mean, you look at the shape of the curve and just how much more natural language ability it has. These conversational models can really humanize the research process in a way that makes people feel like they are conversing, that they're not just having to fill out those, those horrible box and circle forms that Eileen was talking about. So I think that, even though I've been a bit skeptical and a little bit cynical about the current state of chatbot, when you swear at them and that kind of thing, the potential, actually we're on the cusp of something that is much more natural Turing type conversations.
I think one thing that often gets overlooked also is the amazing access that even small firms have to this kind of technology. And that, previously it was only the huge firms that could really, engage in this kind of making the work light. And the place where from my perspective, and where I sit in this ecosystem, where I see the most benefit from chatbots is in getting through that grunt work of screener, what do you call it, a screener or a profile. But even in qual work or quant work, it doesn't matter, but really asking those initial questions and doing those flow charts in a way that feels human and yet is incredibly efficient, there is a huge place for alleviating just so much grunt work. So we can talk about trust, we can talk about curiosity, we can really focus on the quality of the data.
I would just add, though, Priscilla, one of the things that we actually caution people not to do when they're doing chats is to lead too much with those sorts of demographic questions, because
absolutely,
absolutely. I keep saying we've got to start mirroring what you would do at a cocktail party, which is I would never walk up to somebody and say, "So how old are you and how much money do you make?" I'm an American. People might accuse us of doing that, but we're typically a little more subtle than that. So, keeping in mind that whole humanizing aspect of how would I talk to this person if they were sitting across the table from me.
Eileen, I can't agree more I'm just kind of laughing because I use that cocktail party analogy all the time when I start about chatbots. Nobody likes to be around that person who just shouts from the other side, "Hey, you look nice. You want to get married?"
Yeah, exactly.
It just doesn't work like that. And so, there's absolutely an art to creating a chatbot in a way that's going to not only reduce our work, but it is going to maintain that kind of quality and really build that rapport.
Yeah, I think one of the misconceptions about AI and machine learning in general is that you can just throw all your data at the machine and it will tell you on the other side what's important and what's insightful. And this it kind of reinforces your comments, Ray, that what goes into it and what you do with the data on the other side is what starts to humanize that that data. And when we think about data quality, what's not often discussed is you have the core quality of the data that goes into an AI system, but the absence of data is a real challenge because you are using it as a basis of learning. And even if the data that you have in there is of greatest quality, just the absence of some critical data has profound effects. So as an organization, we kind of think about these systems, how we curate data and the inputs become as important as interpreting the the outputs.
Absolutely. So I'm going to come back now to this topic that Elizabeth has thrown up and broaden it slightly. One of the people writing in the comments, we're obviously living in horrendous times. There was an announcement this week today, I think, from the MRS in the UK, asking all market researchers not to conduct face-to-face research, which will have an enormous impact on the recruiters, the face-to-face establishments and so on in the UK. And this pattern, of course, is happening. Some countries is happening slightly earlier than the UK, some countries later. But the question wasn't about the qualitative. Are there issues about conducting research with people who are being quarantined in their homes? Do we have any confidence that the sort of ratings people are going to give us at the moment are going to be realistic? Does it seem like a good thing for a brand to be contacting you and say, okay, that emergency flight you got back from Latin America to the States, would you recommend the flight? Were you satisfied with the meal? it could look incredibly tone deaf, and it could be quite unreliable. So what are our thoughts? And we are going to discuss this again with another panel on Friday, but what are our thoughts around this table, this metaphorical table of things we should be doing and perhaps things we shouldn't be doing? And just while I give the panel a chance to think of their answers, I asked this in LinkedIn, and Lisa Cortrade of Merck came up with a really, really good point. Right now, we shouldn't be hassling doctors and nurses to do research. They've got bigger jobs to do. And that is from somebody in a pharmaceutical company who, quotes, needs that research, but not as much as other people need those doctors and nurses. So
Amen, Lisa. I mean, really, there's a special place in heaven for our medical professionals right now. And it makes me really proud to be Lisa's friend, to hear her saying, I am putting all of my interests on the back burner. So Ray, thanks for sharing that. It's a great story.
So anybody else, any thoughts about things we should be doing and things maybe we shouldn't be doing?
Well, I mean, I guess there's a little bit across our industry of, a hammer where everything looks like a nail. And there have been a lot, I'm not naming any names because some of these people are my friends, but there's a lot of agencies running, surveys, COVID-19 trackers, state of the nation things. And it seems, we've sort of responded the only way we know how to uncertainty by doing something. And that's to run a load of surveys. I'm not sure quite how well these things are going to be going down or how well they're reflecting, but there's something in me that says, look, this thing is going to end later this year, early next year. The organizations and the brands that are delivering value now and understand the situations that people are going through are going to build more long-term success than the types of organizations that hammer people and say, you still haven't fed back on whether you're satisfied with that flight back, emergency repatriation. So, there is definitely the potential and the need to be with people, to understand them, to deliver value to them, and to figure out what's going on. But beyond that,
Couldn't agree
I'm
more.
not quite sure how to advise specifically what people do right now in research.
Mike, I think you're absolutely right. I think, one would hope that common sense would prevail and that we think about what work we're doing and what seems tone deaf versus, some semblance of normalcy is what we all need at a moment like this. So, for example, a survey on emergency repatriation would be totally tone deaf at the moment. On the other hand, you're home, you need things to do to fill up your time. I don't think we should just put the entire industry on hold. I don't think that serves anybody's needs. So to me, it's a common sense decision. And people will choose to participate. Now, as far as whether we'll get legitimate answers, I mean, Ray, I think the world is full of uncertainty and negativity right this minute, and that may come through in answers, but those answers are real and they reflect the times and they reflect the environment in which our clients are going to need to operate. So I would be less concerned about validity. Lousy purchase intent scores right now might be genuinely lousy purchase intent.
Yeah, I would add to the point that Mike and Annie just made there. All of the managers of organizations at the moment are flying blind. So actually they need help being empathetic. They need help at understanding what people want. And that is where I think we can play the best role in helping them navigate the short, the medium, and hopefully then how to get back into the long term going forward. So I think that is clearly a role. I certainly don't think that we should roll up the industry and go away.
I think from my perspective, the importance of empathy and qualitative understanding and behavioral insights into what's going on with people now, how are they feeling, what are they doing, where are they going with their families and so on, I think is is going to take precedence over wide scale surveying is my feeling for the next little while. But not to not to alarm Paul, whose business clearly depends on that. But no, it's that's just how it feels to me.
Yeah, I think across the board, it's about being very mindful of every project we do, everything we do, and to what extent, and what's the true, value of any piece of activity that we do today.
I think one thing to keep in mind, this is Priscilla, is that fear is such a powerful driver of consumer behavior, even when things are normal. But I think right now the key thing to keep in mind is that things are changing by the hour. And so how do we measure something that really lacks any kind of consistency? And I think we all know this, it rises and falls with news cycles, sadly, but truly. And so I think understanding highs of highs and lows of lows, it's going to be really hard, I think, for a while to get an accurate read on people because of what we understand about the lack of accuracy in self-reporting. I might have felt fine at 9 a.m. and by 11:30, my husband said something that really throws me. And I think this is something we just need to keep in mind. And again, that's just how we feel as humans. So exactly what Paul said would bring that human aspect in it and trust that we're being guided by those right intentions. I will say one other thing is that I really believe in a crisis. Now, I've been through the F5 tornado in Joplin. I've watched my creative studio burn to the ground. So I've been through some of these kinds of things. And I will say that, I don't believe that crisis changes anyone. I do believe it amplifies people. And so people who are driven by positive motivations and truly seek the best for other people, they're going to do that in spades. And people who are looking to take advantage, they are going to do that at a greater level right now. And so I think we just need to understand that. That's my mindset of it. And so it's going to happen on both spectrums, but I don't think you're going to see people really change because of it. And that reflects exactly, in my opinion, directly to companies. Companies have a certain style, certain voice, a certain motivation, and those things are just going to get amplified right now.
Super. Okay, Eileen, Paul, Mike, Priscilla, thank you so much for joining us today and look forward to the next time. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, Ray.
Thanks, Ray.